So the title of this talk, if you look in your program, is The Give and Take of Open Source. Potentially more appropriate title is Setting Expectations in the Participation and Interaction with Open Source Projects, but that's really, really wordy. But hopefully it gives you an idea of roughly what I'm going to be talking about today. But to start off, I should kind of give my bona fides so you know where I'm kind of coming from. Especially with the amount of scientists in here, I should give my bias up front. So I'm a developer at Microsoft, as Andrew said. I work on the same team as the team that provides the free Jupyter Notebook hosting on notebooksazure.com. I'm also one of the Python core developers. I've been on the team now for just over 14 years, so not quite as long as Fernando working on IPython, but almost. And I'm also an open source contributor in just the general world. I think I've contributed to about over 70 projects now, where I've got at least one PR in, and I'm not one of the maintainers. Two of which were actually Jupyter.org and Jupyter Notebooks itself. Now, I'm going to be talking here mostly as a maintainer of various open source projects, but also as a contributor myself, trying to just discuss where and how people can interact with open source in a better way to help keep this wonderful movement going and to make it just more pleasurable for everyone who participates. But to start, we should probably define what an open source project is, because it's kind of a term that we don't necessarily think about deeply. Now, I should clarify, I'm talking about open source projects, not open source code. In my view, basically, the instance you start having any kind of conversation with people, that instantly becomes a project and not code. So the idea that open source to me is just about the code becomes a fallacy the instant you start talking with another person. And to me, an open source project is all about two things: sharing in the maintenance of that project and having fun. Because a lot of us do this in our spare time because we enjoy it, whether it's interacting with people, getting to know people, learning, what have you. The fun part is really important. Now, obviously, the maintenance is also there, right? Like, you wouldn't be working on this project if you didn't want to help see it succeed and keep it using and workable and going forward. So it basically ends up becoming a balance between these two, but they're both really key, because if you're just there to maintain it and you're not enjoying yourself, you will burn out, you won't want to participate, and it'll go away. You can just have fun, but if you're not helping maintain the project, it's going to wither away and people are going to stop caring, so it really is a balancing act. And the way you do this is with people, and this is a tough problem. And so how do you sustain an open source project and keep people going? Well, you basically have to attract new people, and you need to retain the current people. Now, attracting new people basically is key, because if you don't, projects will just wither away as people fall away. People stop participating in open source for various reasons: changing jobs, starting families, what have you. It's all over the map, but people do eventually stop contributing. So if you don't keep bringing in new people, the project will eventually reach no people, and the project just dies. You also have to maintain your current people, though, because they obviously have the breadth of knowledge of how to keep the project running, bring new people in, onboard them, and all that. So once again, it's a real balancing act here between bringing in the new people and making it welcoming, but also making sure that the current people don't get burned out and just walk away too soon before they can keep the inflow of people continuing to keep the project running. So in general, basically where this all breaks down to is we need to work together as a community to set reasonable expectations so that open source is enjoyable for everyone. Because, as I said, if it's not fun and enjoyable, you're just not going to want to do it. And a really key thing here is when working with these projects is they're either volunteering their spare time or someone's paying them, but it probably isn't you paying them to do this. So we really need to work on this symbiotic relationship between maintainers and users and contributors so that everyone feels like they're participating equally and well together, and that there's no animosity anywhere, because as soon as anyone feels animosity toward one of these groups, things just start to fall apart. And unfortunately, we don't always do a great job with this. A good example here, Corey Benfield, if you're from the Python community, you might recognize some of the projects he leads, such as URLub 3, and he's one of the core maintainers of requests, probably one of the largest Python projects out there. And back in November, after I actually had to take a month off myself to prevent burnout, Corey tweeted this of saying, quote, "Here's a bit of real talk for people. I think working in open source software has made me more bitter and short-tempered," end quote. Now, I completely understand this. I will fully admit this has happened to me. Ask my wife, unfortunately. But this is a real problem, right? Corey has a wife, and if she ever came to him and said, "You know what, open source is literally making you bitter and short-tempered, please stop," who do you think Corey's going to choose, his wife or open source? Hopefully he's going to choose his wife. But the key thing here is Corey works as the lead maintainer currently of Eurolib 3, which is a really key project as it's the base level of a lot of networking projects in Python, including requests, which he also is a core maintainer of. So if Corey suddenly burns out and walks away, that's a problem. And so this is a real issue. And if you talk to any developer of any major open source project, whether it's any of the Jupyter maintainers, I know Thomas Coswell from Matplotlib's in the back room somewhere. You can talk to him, various people from Anaconda. Talk to any of them. And a lot of them will tell you that they've all felt like this. And so it's a real issue that we really need to work together as a community to try to work through to try to improve, because if it continues, we're going to have a burnout rate that's going to be really precipitous for these projects, and it's just really unfortunate. So, as I said, the title of this talk is The Give and Take of Open Source, because it really should be a give and take, right? On both sides. So, like, maintainers are giving out software and users are taking it, and users are giving back bug reports and such, and the maintainers are taking it. And it's very much the symbiotic relationship of give and take back and forth. And I think the really key thing here that we sometimes lose sight of is when you give something and someone takes it, you really need to be aware of what you're taking to set proper expectations. So you don't expect too much, because when you start to expect more than the person giving you expects you to basically expect, there can be this disconnect, and it really leads to some clashing, because suddenly you're expecting more than you're actually being given, and then people have disagreements. So I'm just going to quickly go through some typical open source scenarios to try to point out where this tends to fall apart. Now, some of you might be in the audience thinking this is really obvious and stuff, but it really isn't for a lot of people, because if you really don't stop and think about the way you word things and the way you state things, you really don't quite realize the impact you're having on people. So for instance, using open source, right? So as a maintainer, I happily give you source code that I've written and produced to the world for you to use. That's fantastic. You as a user get to take it, but you take it without basically complaining. That's all I ask. Don't yell at me, is more or less it. Because really what happens is you can really end up with some really negative feedback phrased in really bad ways, and it emotionally, honestly, can hurt, right? Like, you can write a blog post where you just totally rant and rave about Python and say, oh, geez, why the heck did they do that? That is stupid. That is bad design. Why? But you know what? That blog post can end up in the front of Hacker News, and then I get a hold of it, and I notice it, and I read it. And suddenly I have someone basically calling me stupid, right? I mean, it really does get to the core. It really hits you hard. And you really don't think about it, right? It's just my blog on my little website, on my little post, but the internet is very easy to search, and stuff percolates up whether you expect it or not. So it's all public. So something we really have to be cognizant of, right? It's okay to say, you know, I don't understand why they'd made this design decision or what have you, and that's totally fine. It's fine to honestly ask, but making assumptions really, assumptions that are very negative can really be a gut punch. And it can also go the other way, right? Like, if you come and provide feedback saying, hey, you know, I was wondering why you did this, or hey, would it be possible to potentially do this? I'm thinking it might be useful. As a maintainer, I should be very respectful of you taking the time to think this through, right? And propose and coming forward and putting the effort in to give me feedback, right? I shouldn't say, nah, whatever, just go away. You don't know what you're talking about. Because that's really dismissive, and you've probably put in a lot of time and effort and thought about things. You may have had conversations over lunch with your coworkers and really put in the effort, right? And I should be respectful of that, right? And so once again, it's a symbiotic relationship of I'll give you stuff, you accept it, great, you provide feedback, I take it back and I accept it, great, but everyone's just very cognizant of the fact that it's very much a give and take relationship here, and everyone's just basically being nice. Because it's very easy to forget to say things like, it's just my opinion, and I'm just asking, and I'm just being very upfront and just trying to be respectful without just going, yeah, that's just stupid on either side. And this also comes from contributors giving to maintainers, right? Like, you might want to contribute something like a pull request, right? Because you found a bug or you have a feature or something you want to put in. Well, you also have to realize that a lot of people are volunteers, and so they have a limited amount of time. So they're going to have their own priorities, and they're going to have their own needs, because also if they're getting paid by someone, they're getting paid to do something specific, which might not align with what you want. And so you need to at least take the contribution respectfully and understanding that someone quite possibly put in hours and hours and hours of work into this, And even though you don't take it, you should at least be thoughtful and respectful and thankful for them to at least care enough that they wanted to do this. So once again, I want to make sure everyone understands, I'm not putting blame on users or contributors versus maintainers. All parties involved need to be respectful of people. And the same goes going back, feedback on a contribution. You might make this contribution, and I might think, oh, I could have done that in 10 minutes. Well, you may have taken hours. But then again, I've been writing the core of Python for 14 years now, and you may have started less than a year ago. So it's being really cognizant, once again, of not knowing people's backgrounds and where they're coming from and what they put in. And that's being really understanding and able to really basically, once again, work together to be understanding of each other and where people come from, to be respectful. And this extends all the way to maintainers working with each other, right? Like, I have personally had arguments with other core maintainers on Python because people have bad days, right? And sometimes people get bent out of shape over little things, and everyone just needs to understand, once again, a lot of us are volunteers, there's only so much time in the day, and we just need to be understanding that I might not be able to get something that someone else wants me to get to because, you know what, I have a wife, I have a cat, they take up time. And so you really need to just be understanding, once again, that just because you might have 10 hours a week to do it, or 20 or what have you, because you're still in grad school like I used to be, I don't have that kind of time anymore. So it's once again, understanding, just being very respectful of where people are coming from, because in the end, we're all doing favors for each other, really. We like to call this as volunteering, but unfortunately it hasn't quite seemed to have seeped in well that volunteering really means that people are making a sacrifice. Because when you think volunteering, you think, oh, I'm going down to the soup kitchen on Thanksgiving and helping the homeless get soup or something, right? That's, okay, I'm sacrificing my time, I'm giving it up, but no big deal. There's a bit more of a sacrifice, I think, going forward in terms of just time, because people get very emotionally involved with open source. As I said earlier, when you say, like, Python's stupid, I take that kind of personally, because you're basically calling something I've spent 14 years of my life on stupid. I mean, it really needs to be thought through that everyone's doing favors for each other, really, in the end, right? Like, I'm trying to do you a favor by giving you software that I've written. You're trying to do me favors by giving me feedback. Same thing with issues, reports, pull requests back and forth. It's all favors with each other. And I would hope that we can all remember what favors are like. Like, you're trying to do something nice, but don't be too ambitious with what you expect back, but just be appreciative that someone at least tried, even if you don't take it. And lastly, because I can't convince people who are volunteers to necessarily do the right thing, I can at least talk to people who get paid to do this, because I can talk to your employer. And if there was one thing I think could really help people when they do open source, is to really stop and think about what you're about to say. Because once again, the internet's very public and it's very permanent, and people don't forget. At least I don't. So whenever you're about to do anything online with open source, to try to keep this whole give and take in perspective and everything, do try to remember that you are basically going to be asking me a favor and vice versa. So this is going to be a conversation, and we're going to be working together. But really, the critical thing here is everyone's just trying to be doing favors for each other, so just keep that in perspective. The other thing is, assume your boss is going to read whatever you say. You are representing your company, and once again, the internet doesn't forget. So I think everyone wants to make sure their company has a good reputation online, because this has been a problem I've seen before, where people work at a company and say, well, I work for company X, and so you should do this for me. It's like, no. Not with that attitude. And I don't forget. The other thing is, you can just, if you don't care what your boss thinks, maybe you care what my parents think, because basically if you think it's going to seem insulting to my parents, maybe you shouldn't say it to me, please. And maybe if you still don't care about your boss or my parents, maybe you care at least about your parents, and maybe you don't want to make it look like, basically if you're going to embarrass your parents, you probably don't want to say it either. So chances are either you care about what your boss thinks, my parents think, or your parents think somehow. So please take that into consideration when you interact with open source projects, because really, open source is fantastic, and I think we can all work together very harmoniously and be able to continue this contribution work going forward, so that we can continue to have really impactful, happy contributions to open source. Thank you.